Welcome to the UN Global Compact Academy session focused on how to set science-based targets aligning with the 1.5 degree pathways. The Academy is designed to give participants of the UN Global Compact the knowledge and skills you need to meet your sustainability objectives. Today's session will give you the latest on how companies get their science-based targets with the new level of ambition, one that aligns with the latest climate science or with 1.5 degree pathways. My name is Heidi Huusko. I'm a senior manager here at the UN Global Compact and also a steering committee member of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. I will kickstart today's session by setting the context of the upcoming UN Climate Action Summit and how the private sector can contribute with bold leadership to that event. We will then hear practically how the telecommunications company Ericsson has already set a science-based targets which is aligning with the 1.5 degree scenario. Our colleagues Alberto at CDP and Cynthia at WRI, both part of the steering committee of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, will then present our new updated guidance to help you find the right tools and criteria to raise corporate targets in practice. As a gentle reminder, in a previous Academy session, we did a deep dive on Science-Based Targets Initiative process and methodology. Today's session is all about the latest update to help you align with latest climate science. If you didn't get a chance to revisit the previous session and material beforehand, it is available anytime on the Academy Learning platform. Some general housekeeping for today's session. So throughout today's session, you will have the opportunity to ask questions to the speakers using the Q&A feature on the platform and also make any comments using the chat feature. Take a second to locate the chat and the Q&A feature right now. My colleagues will be answering some of the questions via text, and we will also leave time at the end of the session to answer questions live. So do keep them coming. And I also want to ensure that Chris from WWF is also online to provide some of those answers to the questions. So to begin the sessions, I'd like to start with two polls. The first one, my company has set a science-based target. Yes, we have validated target. Yes, we have committed to set a science-based target. No, but we are planning to commit. No, but we want to learn more. And the last one, not sure. Please take a moment and fill in the poll. All right, excellent. We can see that there's a variety of participants at today's call, and we're happy to see that there's so many of you also who are here to learn more, and some of you who are probably here to learn more on how you can update or ramp up the ambition of the target. So let's move to the next poll. For those of you who already have a science-based target, is it aligned with 1.5? So there was a few of you who said that you already have a science-based target. Would you please want to vote to see if, yes, we are aligned with 1.5, no, but we will review our target, or lastly, no, but we are interested in learning more. Excellent. So many of you are interested in learning more, and some of you are also aligned with 1.5 already, and that is excellent news. And please ensure to be part of the chat function throughout, and also share some of your experiences as well. And then, of course, we will have the Q&A after the speakers has presented. So let's start to look a little bit at the state of play of where we stand on climate action and our climate change challenge. So in 2015, the Paris Agreement was negotiated, and part of this Paris Agreement are something called the national determined contributions. And these are the national policies of each of the countries that are part of the Paris Agreement, and they set the pathway of how the country lives up to the Paris Agreement well below 2 degrees towards 1.5 degree warming of our planet. Unfortunately, all of these plans are, when they summed up, are not sufficient. The IPCC report last year is a very stark reminder that we need to ramp up our ambition, and that is why the UN Secretary General is convening a UN Climate Summit in New York on 23rd of September to raise the ambition, and this is also why we at the Science Based Targets Initiative are providing you with updated methodologies. So the UN Secretary General has said climate change is the challenge of our lifetime, and he's really calling on all sectors of societies. He's calling on heads of states, of business, civil society, and other actors to come to New York and show bold leadership. And especially the leadership from the private sector will really send a strong market signal as we create ambitious solutions to a world where no one is left behind. And here at the UN Global Compact, we're helping to drive business ambition and innovation to ensure meaningful private sector contributions to the summit preparations. So I also wanted to show you the organigram of the preparations of the UN Climate Action Summit. So as I mentioned, the Secretary General is asking everyone to come with bold announcements and actions. He is also looking for champions to each of these action areas that you see here listed on your screen. And as you can see, the contributions from private sector is very vital in all of these topics, from mitigation strategy to energy transition to infrastructure, industry, resilience, nature-based solutions, and climate finance. And the way the summit preparations are taking form is that each of these action areas have coalitions where there is both government and UN and other organizations that are contributing. And right now, the team who are preparing for the summit are looking for champions from the private sector to help support and make sure that business come forward with some very bold, measurable and scalable announcements to ratchet up climate ambition. And these private sector announcements, they can take form of being individual, transformational announcements. They can be collective actions, such as aligning with science-based targets at 1.5. It can be about decarbonization of your sector and being part of a sector movement. And they can also be public-private partnerships that are contributing to a systems change. So for the UN Global Compact, we wanted to show you some of our key 3 areas of work in the lead up to the summit. And the first is to raise ambition and align with 1.5 degrees Celsius through corporate mitigation and adaptation measures, and in your efforts to deliver the net zero economy by 2050. We're also working on a very exciting new topic around measuring carbon removal together with WRI and Volans. And this is to foster innovation and also understand better the pathway of nature-based solutions in carbon removal. And this is a initiative that will fit on into a corporate science-based target and then look at various offsetting methodologies. And the third one is ambition loops, and this is an initiative and a methodology that we launched last year together with the WRI and We Mean Business. And ambition loops, it's all about enhancing national climate policies and scale local public-private partnerships and a just transition. And you'll be able to find more information of all of this on our website. And today we're looking at raising ambition with and ensuring that science-based targets can be ramped up to 1.5 degrees Celsius. With that said, let's just have a quick review on what a science-based target is. So many of you already know that targets that are adopted by companies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are considered science-based targets if they are in line with the latest climate science says is necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. In these public-private dialogues, it's also good to know that science-based targets can be seen as the private sector equivalent to the national determined contributions that I just explained are part of the Paris Agreement. So we also call them business NDCs. And you'll see some figures here on the side. The Science-Based Targets Initiative is growing at a very fast pace. We have over 550 companies who have formally committed to set a science-based target. Through the validations of our technical experts, 204 of those targets have been approved. And we see an average of 4 companies joining our call to action every week. And we hope to get many of you that are online now also to join us. So just a quick reminder of what the process looks like. You first make a formal commitment. You'll find the letter on the Science-Based Targets Initiative website. Then you get up to 24 months to go back to your company. You get to work on how to develop that target and use much of the material and guidance that is available. And Ericsson will shortly talk more about that process. You will then submit your targets for validation to the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and our experts will make sure that it does align with our criteria and the guidance, and there will be some back and forth between our initiative and your company. And then finally, we will announce the target, and we will also help you with some of the outreach around and profiling around your company setting a target. Great. So let's move onwards, and let's hear from Mats Pellbäck Scharp, who is Head of Sustainability at Ericsson.
Yes, hello everybody. Just to start with, I was asked to sort of give you a little bit about what Ericsson is because not everybody knows about it. Ericsson is in fact 140 years old, so that's why we have this old picture, and it was founded from the beginning on the notion that communication is a basic human need. And while other companies were focusing on the rich people, Ericsson was focusing on communication for all. So I think it's in our DNA to work with sustainability from that perspective and with the company purpose. And that's why we have been over 100 years in Latin America, Russia, Africa, China, and across the globe. And in fact, Stockholm had more phone lines in 1890 than New York, London, Paris, or any other city in the world. So that is sort of a little bit about the background, and you can see some of the other numbers. We are quite a global company and has been that for a very long time. So that said, moving on to the science-based targets and what we have been doing on that. So for the next slide. Why did we do it to start with before we go into some of the process? I think the main reason for us was really to be ready for the future, to be a proactive company, and as our CEO wrote there, it's about as a sustainability pioneer. We have been working with this for a very long time, and we also look at all our impact from 3 different horizons. One is the Ericsson impact, our own impact, scope 1 and 2, is from a climate or a carbon footprint perspective, and then our product and industry impact, which is then scope 3. And as we have our biggest impact in scope 3, this has been a lot of our focus. But as we are part of the digitalization and driving change in society, and as you see on sort of this slide as well, on the exponential roadmap report that we were part of creating, we also have a huge impact on other sectors. So that is how we work with climate. And then the other part, beyond being in ready for the future and in control of the cost, it's about innovation and product development, really to have products and services that are prepared and helping our customers become effective and competitive. We also drive a lot of employee engagement and pride. As all of us know that are on this call, climate is in the media all the time. In some cases it's denial, but in most places of the world it's really the concern that people are feeling. And as Greta was saying, I mean, she wants us to feel that the house is on fire, and I think that is really where we need to go on that. And then if we as a company can show that we are part of the solution and driving the targets both on our own activities but also for the whole industry, then that creates a lot of pride and a sense of engagement in the company. Then we have the efficiency and resource awareness. I mean, when companies are in problems, they have a good driver to sort of be effective and save money. But when the money is coming into the company, then that goes away a little bit. And then climate is a really good reminder of another reason why we really need to be careful with efficiencies and travel and all the resources that we're using. And then finally, I think the last reason why we are doing it is really to have the credibility and in the dialogue. If we want to be credible when we talk about our industry's impact on other sectors and our solutions for transport or for other areas, then we really need to sort of clean our own house first and get that in order. Secondly, work together with our customers to help them, and finally talk about other sectors. So that is sort of the reasons why we're doing it. And then my final part of this presentation is about then how we did it and what we did. So we have 2 targets. As I said, we have one that is on own activities, but as that is, if you look from a life cycle assessment on our product and the total impact of our company, then that is about 1% of our total impact comes from own activities, while over 80% of our impact comes from product in operation. Sorry, the light went out in the room, but anyway. So then the other part is about product in operation. So the way that we are driving it is really to work on these 2 targets. And what we did was that we looked on an absolute impact. We set the baseline in 2016, and then we said that if we do this 35%, then we are well on the way. And as we were working with the exponential roadmap work, in parallel to this, we also knew that we need to halve our emissions by 2030. So based on that, we said that we want to have an aggressive target, but we don't want to set the target at 2030 because our realization is that our management and also all decision makers, they will not start acting if you set a target that is too far out in the future. So you really need to break it down and get closer to now when you set your target, working maximum on the 5-year timeline or something like that. Otherwise, you will not get the action going until you will just postpone the activities in the companies for later and wait for some future activities. So our experience is really to put the target in a shorter perspective. That's why we put it in, sort of in a 5-year timeline instead of putting it at 2030. So, and that's also what we did before. So looking at these 35% between 2016 and 2022, those should be put in context of the target that we had before, that we reduced 50% between 2012 and 2017, which was the previous 5-year period. So together this is close to 70% reduction in those 10 years. With that said, I'll sort of hand the word back to you, Heidi.
Thank you so much, Mats. I think that was very, very clear, and it's also interesting to hear how you speak about the timelines and the fact that we need to look at, action now and how science-based targets really can help you showcase that as well. Could you elaborate a little bit before we move into the other speakers as well, how you have used this approach also when it comes to your dialogue with decision makers throughout your headquarters, but throughout the value chain?
Definitely. I mean, there are two parts of this. I think internally, when it comes to decision makers in the company, we have used this to drive a lot of innovation in product development, and also what we have used is that, I mean, we as a company, when you talk about strategy in the future, you try to make a lot of projections and sort of look into the future, and then anything that we know about the future is that we don't know anything about it except for one thing, and that is that the globe will become warmer and we will have more and more problems if we don't do anything. So from a strategic perspective, I think that this is one of the things that we are sure about, and we can speculate about how the market develops and geopolitics between Russia and US or whatever, China, what is happening in that area. But this is something that we know, and we know that these are the challenges for the whole world, so these are business opportunities. So that is how we sort of drove the discussion internally and to get attention.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for highlighting those internal processes as well, and talking with you and also with many other companies who have set science-based targets. We also really see that there is a clear business case in having a science-based target, and we did some research with the companies who have already set a science-based targets, and in fact 79% of the company executives says that it had boosted brand reputation. So you'll see that having a science-based target will actually help you in showcasing that you have taken ambitious action on climate, and it's also validated by a set of NGOs and a UN entity. And 55% of companies say that it's also gained in competitive advantage. 29% say that there are bottom line savings. Many companies speak about, the energy efficiency that also comes with setting a science-based targets. And last but not least, more and more investors are also looking at this. And 53% of the investors of the companies are saying that it also brings investor confidence into the company once you've set a science-based target. So thanks so much, Mats, for that, and we'll get back to you at the Q&A very soon after we've heard from Alberto from CDP. Alberto Pineda, you are the Director of Science-Based Targets and Renewable Energy at CDP, and I'll hand over to you to take us through some of the technical elements of the updates that we have just launched.
Thanks a lot, Heidi, and hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today. To start with, just a quick reminder on what science-based targets are. Science-based targets are greenhouse gas emission reduction targets that are consistent with the goal of keeping warming well below 2 degrees or at 1.5 degrees, in line with the Paris Agreement goals. And we're also addressing or making sure that these targets drive to short-term action, as we just heard from Ericsson, that targets cover the most relevant sources of emissions within the value chain of the company. And science-based targets put companies on a trajectory to reach net zero emissions in a time frame that is consistent with the Paris goals. And in a way, part of the work that we do in the Science-Based Targets Initiative is to translate these global goals into tools and resources that companies can use to set their own targets. And the SBTI recently released a new set of resources that enable companies to set targets in line with 1.5 degrees. All of these resources are available on our website, sciencebasedtargets.org, and I'll just briefly walk you through some of them. Next slide, please. So starting with a brief overview of the IPCC report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. For those of you that may have not seen it, it's the latest report that was released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it was particularly focused on exploring the risks and also opportunities of keeping warming at 1.5 degrees, and some of the risks that we take if we exceed 1.5 degrees of global warming. It's a very comprehensive report. It's building on over 6,000 references and contributions from over 130 contributing authors. And the most important thing for us, next slide please, is the report is presenting or assessed a number of scenarios and pathways that are basically consistent with the goals set in the Paris Agreement. As you can see from the screen, there's a number of scenarios that were assessed in this report that are consistent with keeping warming at 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. And the IPCC classified these scenarios in these different categories depending on how much, well, first of all, what is the temperature goal that they would be reaching at the end of the century? And second of all, how much overshoot, how much they are exceeding this temperature threshold throughout the 21st century. And so there's the most ambitious scenarios called below 1.5, which are scenarios that ensure that 1.5 degrees are reached towards the end of the century and with no or limited overshoot. And then from there we have a range of scenarios that were also assessed, including scenarios that keep warming at 2 degrees at the end of the century. All these range in between. And so what the SBTI did, next slide please, to translate these set of scenarios that were assessed by the IPCC into resources and tools that can be used for science-based target setting is we defined a number of parameters to identify scenarios that are fully consistent with this range of well below 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, considering some aspects, for instance, making sure that scenarios lead to short-term action, and that means that emissions peak by 2020. We only consider scenarios that we consider feasible or realistic. We avoided scenarios that rely excessively on carbon removals or negative emissions. And based on that, we identified a subset of scenarios that are consistent with the two main categories that we are using now in the Science-Based Targets Initiative for science-based target setting, 1.5 degrees and well below 2 degrees. These scenarios are informing the development of thresholds that allow us and also companies to model targets that are basically based on this subset of scenarios assessed by the IPCC. and also it allows us to assess targets against these goals. If you go to next slide, please. This is just a high-level overview about the resources that have been developed by the Science Based Targets Initiative based on the IPCC Special Report on 1.5 degrees. Some of these are new resources. Some of these are revised resources. And as you can see, the foundation of these is what we call the foundations of science-based target setting, that really explains how the initiative has translated these scenarios that come from a number of climate modeling groups and how we are translating those scenarios for the determination of parameters for science-based target setting. Then I would say all the technical part and all the science behind science-based targets is well described in this first document, Foundations of Science-Based Target Setting. Then the second document, what we call Science-Based Target Setting Manual, that describes how companies can go through the process of science-based target setting according to their individual circumstances, and it provides some recommendations and business case for driving the process within companies. Once companies are ready to submit targets to the initiative, they should be aware about the criteria that we use to assess targets. The new criteria that were released by the initiative are version 4, and these new criteria are applicable from October onwards. At the moment, we are still using the previous version of the criteria, version 3 of the criteria. And we published a new document that we call the Target Validation Protocol that provides details on how the initiative assesses targets and also how we ensure that the targets are in line with the criteria set by the initiative, and also how we are determining whether these targets are consistent with 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. And finally, we updated the forms that are used by companies to submit targets, and also the documents that are used by the initiative to communicate with companies throughout the target validation process. All of these resources are available on our website, and I'll briefly walk you through a couple of them so that you have an idea about the type of resources and capabilities from these resources. So this is the outcome of the analysis done to the subset of scenarios, and also this is captured in the target validation protocol. As you can see, we have identified reduction rates that are applicable for different temperature levels. And this is only for absolute reduction targets. So if you look at the first column on the left, you can see the 3 different temperature levels that are currently assessed by the initiative: 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees, and 1.5 degrees. Then the column in the middle provides the average annual rate of reduction that is applicable for each of these. And so for 2 degrees, the minimum reduction rate is 1.23% per year. For well below 2 degrees, the range is, the minimum reduction rate is 2.5 degrees, and any reduction rate above 4.2% is considered to be in line with 1.5 degrees. And from October onwards, the minimum rate of ambition that will be acceptable by the initiative will be what we identified as well below 2 degrees, so 2.5% per year. And from now until October, we are still validating targets that are in line with 2 degrees. This is for absolute reduction targets. It is also possible for companies to set intensity targets based on the sectoral decarbonization approach, which is one of the methods that the initiative recognizes for science-based target setting. And this is largely based on IEA scenarios. For IEA scenarios, basically the 2DS pathway from the IEA Energy Technologies Perspective report is more or less consistent with the level of ambition that we are considering 2 degrees. The B2DS scenario from the same report from the IEA is more or less consistent with what we consider well below 2 degrees. And targets that are modeled using the B2DS pathway will be classified as well below 2 degrees. And then for the time being, we don't have scenarios from the IEA that are consistent with the level of ambition that the SBTI considers consistent with keeping warming or with limiting warming at 1.5 degrees. Again, the detail on how we determine these thresholds can be found on the document called Foundations of Science-Based Targets that is on our website. Now, another feature and tool that we released is a new science-based target setting tool. In the past, the initiative had a tool that enabled companies to model targets using the sectoral decarbonization approach methodology, the SDA approach. And now we are introducing this tool that allows companies to model targets using different approaches and different scenarios. As you may see from the tabs below, the tool has 2 main components, what we call SBT tool, that allows companies to model scope 1 and scope 2 reduction targets against different scenarios. And then we also introduced a scope 3 tool that allows companies to model scope 3 targets that are consistent with the criteria defined by the SBTI. And this tool allows companies to model targets that are expressed in different ways. For the SBT tool for scope 1 and scope 2, companies can model absolute reduction targets and also physical intensity reduction targets through the SDA. And for scope 3, companies can model absolute reduction targets, also economic intensity reduction targets and physical intensity reduction targets, which are the different approaches that are recognized by the initiative. The tool is available on our website, and yeah, you can download it from there. Yeah, this is just to show how the tool works. It's an Excel tool. It doesn't run on macros, so you can run it safely on your computer. And basically, as with the previous tool, for those of you that were familiar with the tools developed by the Science-Based Targets Initiative, it requires some parameters to be defined by the user, including, of course, the approach that is going to be used to model the target, the scenario that is going to be used to model the target, and then information specific about the company. What is the base year that is going to be used to model the target? What is the target year? What are the emissions in the base year? And what is the projected growth that the company is planning during the target period? And based on this information, the tool basically already provides what would be a target that would be consistent with the range of ambition acceptable under the initiative. Next slide, please. So this is just one example of how what the tool produces. And as you can see, for instance, in this case, we have 2 charts on the right. One of them is consistent with well below 2 degree pathways. The other one is consistent with 1.5 degree pathways. And the tool provides the level of reduction that will be consistent with these 2 pathways within the time frame defined by the company. And all the emissions data for this range of years. Again, this is just one example of how the tool can be used, and we really encourage you to go through our website and to look at all these resources that have been developed.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alberto, for going through all of those materials. And it's actually a tremendous amount of work that the Science Based Targets Initiative have put to review all the existing materials and make sure that this is available. So thanks for giving everyone an update around that. We will now move to Cynthia Cummis, who is the Director of Private Sector Climate Mitigation at WRI. And Cynthia, you will cover some of the questions that we get, a lot of questions around, and it's around Scope 3 target setting. And while Cynthia is providing you an update around this, please make sure to continue to type in questions. Chris and Alberto will continue to answer some of those, and then we will wrap up with a few of them in the panel. So Cynthia, over to you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Heidi. So I will just review for everybody what our current approach is to Scope 3 target setting. Since our earlier version of our target validation criteria, we haven't made any major updates to our criteria on Scope 3 targets. We have made some clarification and refinements, and so I'll review here what the expectations are on Scope 3 targets. So here's just a list of some of the key requirements or key target validation criteria that we have. So the first is we first expect that all companies are going to complete a full Scope 3 inventory. That can be just some high-level estimate of Scope 3 emissions using average data sources. No need to collect primary data or try to collect primary data from suppliers and customers, but you do need to understand just the relative significance of Scope 3 emissions to begin with. So once you've done that, then if a company's Scope 3 emissions are 40% or more of total Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, then we expect that companies will set a Scope 3 target. And then the boundary, once you know that you need to set a Scope 3 target, then you have to determine what is the boundary of that target, there are 15 Scope 3 emissions categories, which of those categories need to be in the target. And so our criteria around the boundary is that it needs to cover at least 2/3 of total Scope 3 emissions. And just because we want companies to focus on, to try to capture at least the majority of their emissions in that target. And then the time frame for the targets is consistent with Scope 1 and 2 targets. And we say it should be a minimum of 5 years, a maximum of 15 years out into the future. We encourage companies to set longer term targets in addition to these 5 to 15 year targets, although it's not required. And then we also have this other type of target setting in addition to emission reduction targets that are called supplier engagement targets. That's an option for Scope 3, and those have some slightly different criteria that I'll mention in a later slide. Okay, next slide. So with the caveat that we understand that Scope 3 targets setting is different than setting targets around Scope 1 and 2. So we understand that it can be more difficult to realize emission reductions in the value chain than within a company's own operations. And so we've developed the criteria with that understanding. So there are a few different methods that we use for validation of company Scope 3 targets, and these are the methods that we also recommend companies use to model their Scope 3 targets. So around Scope 3, companies can set emission reduction targets similar to Scope 1 and 2 targets, or they can set these supplier engagement targets. For emission reduction targets, they can set an absolute emission reduction target around Scope 3 using absolute contraction. This is one option. So what's different here with the Scope 1 and 2 targets is our expectation for level of ambition, or the way that we validate the ambition of the targets, is still to use a 2-degree level of ambition as the minimum. And we also, through the the SBT tool, we do now enable companies to model their Scope 3 targets, which we didn't have that tool for Scope 3 previously. And now you can model the target using all 3 levels of ambition. So it would enable companies to go beyond 2-degree level of ambition if interested, but the minimum level of ambition that we validate is against 2 degrees for absolute emission reduction targets against for Scope 3. And here's just an example of one target that's been validated using absolute contraction. And companies can also set Scope 3 emission reduction targets that are intensity targets. And these can be physical intensity targets or economic intensity targets. So for physical intensity target, one option is to use the sectoral decarbonization if the pathways are relevant. They're not relevant for many sectors, so we also have other options. You can also use the physical intensity target as the metric to represent your target, just as long as it translates to an absolute emission reduction target in line with the 2-degree level of ambition. And AB InBev here you can see is an example here of a physical intensity target. This goes across scopes 1, 2, and 3. So they set one target, which just captured Scope 3. There's this other category called other and physical intensity targets. So we don't use an SBT method to validate this type of target. This is just a physical intensity target where it results in no absolute increase in emissions based on the company's expected growth rate. And there's a physical emissions intensity improvement of 2% per average over the target period. And there's one example here, a target that was validated using this method. And the final intensity approach is economic intensity targets using this method called GIVA. And under this method, you can set an economic intensity target. So it would be like emissions per value added using like an economic metric as the denominator rather than a physical intensity metric like mass or volume as the denominator. The minimum level of ambition is a 7% annual improvement rate on an intensity basis. Okay, next slide. Okay, so then the other option for setting a Scope 3 target is what we call a supplier engagement target. And so with this type of target, a company commits to drive the adoption of SBTs among its suppliers or customers. You can use this, generally companies are using this for the purchased goods and services category of Scope 3 emissions, but there are other categories of emissions it could be relevant to, such as upstream transportation or downstream leased assets. And most commonly companies are setting these targets to engage suppliers in Tier 1. For many companies, they don't have relationships with Tier 2 suppliers, so the coverage of these targets are generally around Tier 1 suppliers. But if a company does have relationships with Tier 2 suppliers, it could cover them as well. We don't specify the tiers of suppliers, we just specify the coverage of percentage of emissions or spend that it needs to cover. So on the right-hand side, you see here that around the time period is different for these targets. We want them to happen sooner so we can really scale up the adoption of science-based targets, which will then result in emission reductions. So we say that the targets have to be a maximum of 5 years into the future. And then the target also has to provide the percentage of suppliers that are covered by either emissions or spend. And then you can see here on the bottom of the slide an example of one of these targets. So Sumitomo Chemicals commits that 90% of its suppliers by product weight, that's how they're determining the coverage of suppliers, will set science-based targets themselves by 2024. Now, some companies for scope 3, if the supplier engagement target can cover 2/3 of total emissions, they can just set a supplier engagement target. But in many cases, companies are combining the use of an emission reduction target and a supplier engagement target to get to the boundary coverage of 2/3 of scope 3 emissions. Next slide. So the practice of scope 3 target setting is very new. Until the initiative came along, it was launched in 2015, there were virtually no companies setting comprehensive scope 3 reduction targets. So this is a quickly evolving practice, and we're trying to evolve our criteria as we see new best practices evolve, and ramping up ambition as we see that companies are capable of achieving it. And right now we've been saying scope 3 targets have to be ambitious. We're not defining them as science-based targets, or the minimum level of ambition is not a science-based target right now. But over the next year, we're going to be doing a more detailed review of where we are with scope 3 target setting and updating our approach. One thing that we're about to launch is we're about to conduct a research paper to look at all the scope 3 targets that have already been validated. That's over, close to 90% of all the targets that have been validated include a scope 3 component. So we have lots of targets to look at and evaluate, and we'll be seeing what the companies are doing to make progress in achieving their targets and seeing what barriers they're facing, and understanding best practices. And we think that will be helpful in updating our approach. And we'll also be seeking feedback from companies and other stakeholders on recommended revisions, in addition to some other activities yet to be defined. And then here you can just see the tension that we have. You can get the example. This is just an example of feedback that we've been getting over the last few years on the approach. While many companies have been saying that our criteria is not consistent with what's currently feasible, we're also getting feedback from other stakeholders saying that that the initiative is not credible unless scope 3 targets are also aligned with current climate science. So we have this current tension that we will need to manage as we review our approach and refine it. And we'll be seeking your input over the coming year.
Great. Thanks so much, Cynthia. That's very clear, and I think you covered a lot of the main questions that we keep getting also to the initiative. And thank you everyone who is online, who's been so active in asking questions, and thanks to our experts who's been making sure that these questions are being answered. So I'm also going to ask Mats and Alberto to turn on the cameras, and we'll have a quick set of some of the questions that have come in. And I'll start with one question. There was a few questions around how various sectors are engaging in science-based targets and what materials are available. So Cynthia and Alberto, this is really for you. More on what are the sector refinements that are in the making. There's specifically questions around chemical, aluminium, oil and gas, for instance.
Okay, I could start with that, and then Alberto can add any additional information. So most of our resources to date have been general and applied to any sector. And then over the last couple of years, we've been moving into developing sector-specific resources. And that can include new target setting methods, refinement of existing methods, or just some guidance on how to apply science-based target setting methods. So we have a whole variety of sector-specific initiatives going on right now, one with the apparel sector, aluminum sector, transportation, and some new ones that will be launched in the coming year on oil and gas and chemicals. I'm sure I'm missing others that are currently in process. And these are generally being led by one partner or in combination. And there's lots of resources on our website about each of those sector efforts that you can find, where you can find more details.
Excellent, exactly, and I'll loop back into the Scope 3 discussion and ask Mats about that. How did you think about setting a Scope 3 that was still very ambitious, and how do you think about engaging your supply chain? Could you share a few of what you think could be best practices for the other businesses online?
Yes. I think that the Scope 3 target requires that you have a good understanding of your life cycle impact. So you need to understand if you have a lot of your impact in supply chain, or if you have a lot of the impact in other phases of the life cycle. And for us, as a company, over 80% of our impact based on the life cycle assessments that we have done. I mean, we started already in 1990. Early 90s anyway. So doing life cycle assessments of mobile networks, and we saw that the majority of our impact is in the usage phase of the product. So I think that's the same for several products, several consumer products, and also like washing machines and cars and so on. They have the majority of the Scope 3 in the user phase, like for us. So for us, it's a Scope 3 target is the product energy consumption target. So we set the target for absolute consumption of running a specific site, and then we looked on sort of our portfolio that we sold in 2016, and then for each year we see that we need to keep on sort of a reduction level of 35% compared with that baseline of 2016, and looking at what products we sell in a certain year, following that year by year, and seeing that we are tracking towards the 35% reduction of absolute energy consumption to provide that for our customers, and that will impact then the life cycle of our or the energy bill of our customers. So that is a win-win from that perspective as well.
Great, and I think that segues nicely into a question that I wanted to prompt to Alberto very quickly. Is we have over 550 companies who have committed to science-based targets, but why are we not bigger than that? Why are there not more companies? Who are we targeting, and why are we not maybe targeting all of the companies in Ericsson's supply chain, Alberto?
That's what we wonder every day. But I think we are targeting the largest companies. We identified nearly 2,000 companies that influence about 70% of global emissions. And this is the audience or the target group that the initiative is addressing. And we believe that by focusing on these largest companies, we have good chances of making significant impact on global emissions. And through different mechanisms like supplier engagement, as Cynthia presented, but also through growing action from investors, we believe that these companies can accelerate the action of science-based targets to other companies and to smaller companies. We are confident that this is something that can become a common practice, and that we are just in the earlier phases of this journey.
Great, thank you so much, and I want to remind everyone that all of these materials are also available on the Science Based Targets Initiative website, and I also want to show you some of the next steps. So here are we will be providing everyone with an essentials guide. There will also be a new academy session coming up on the 17th of May, which is a special session with the UN Special Envoy to the Climate Summit. He will give a private sector engagement briefing. You'll all get a reminder about that as well, so you know how you can contribute to the summit preparations. And we all hope to for you to be more inspired now and come back with setting a science-based target. So thanks so much everyone for being with us here today, and please don't hesitate to get back to us to get more guidance, and we will be very helpful with answering some of your questions. So thanks for joining. Bye-bye.